The game is called Total War, so you'd think the whole focus would be on battling. Well, it turns out there's a whole other side to the war machine, and that's the settlements and provinces that support it. Settlement building and management can be a tricky thing to master, so let's go through how to do it and set up your faction for success. And if you want to successfully watch these videos without ads, then consider becoming a member for just $1 a month. All the same videos, just 0 ads. First of all, when managing settlements, there's a few stats that you'll want to keep your eye on. The main one you actually need to worry about is control. Unsurprisingly, this is a measure of how under control a province is. High levels often net you increasing bonuses unique to each faction, alongside adding control penalties to make high levels harder to maintain. Low levels net you penalties for those same stats, but do come with a control increase to help you claw your way back. If control reaches the lower limit, you'll suffer a rebellion, which spawns a hostile army that will raid and eventually attack the host settlement unless wiped out. Rebellions do give a temporary boost to control once eliminated, but this is hardly a fix in the long term. Control is affected by a range of factors such as faction-wide effects, recent conquest, or the presence of armies, both allied and hostile. On a local level, it's always affected by collected tax. This is the baseline penalty that's active as long as you're collecting income. You can switch this off, but you'll be missing out on passive gold per turn, so only do so in emergencies or in provinces making an inconsequential amount of money. There are also certain buildings that can affect control, so these can be worth prioritizing in struggling provinces to keep them running. Corruption often goes hand in hand with control, but can also come with a whole other range of effects. Every faction in the game has some preference of corruption. Some, like the Empire and Dwarves, prefer a lack of any, whereas vampire factions prefer vampiric, for example. For all factions like the Empire who prefer things untainted, the only bonus for having a lack of corruption is a lack of the various penalties each flavour can bring. However, if you're a faction that enjoys a particular flavour, you gain a number of local buffs if your flavour is in high concentration. This varies from flavour to flavour, but you're looking at benefits for you and penalties for enemies. For example, high vampiric corruption grants vampiric factions improved control, improved chances of the dead rising again post-battle, and causes attrition to all non-vampiric armies, acting as a deterrent for invaders. Whenever a particular flavour is high in concentration, it also reduces all other flavours, making it harder for them to take hold. This all sounds way more complicated than it is, so in short, just make sure whatever your faction's preference is dominating as many provinces as you can, and absolutely any that you own, and you should do great. Income is fairly self-explanatory and goes beyond just settlements. This is how much money the province generates per turn, and as I mentioned earlier, you can toggle this to improve control if needs be. Lastly, growth is very important to settlements, but in a different way to control and corruption. Growth ticks up to fill a circle, which, when full, will count up. This is population surplus, and for most factions this is needed to increase the size of your settlements. Similar to control, growth can be affected by faction-wide and local events, as well as lord skills, but the main one is buildings. Higher tier settlements are often the only way to unlock higher tiers of units, so growth is one of the most important things to focus on in the early game to get your armies to maximum power as quickly as possible. There's also this small area at the bottom which shows anything affecting the provinces, be that commandments, events, or anything else. It's not something you'll spend a lot of time looking at, but can come in useful when trying to diagnose something going wrong. Now you know what each of the stats mean, you can start to think about how you want to build up your settlements to meet both the needs of the faction as a whole and those of the province. Putting aside for a moment the needs of the province, when building, I like to alternate between financial and military. Financial is focused on generating as much money as possible, since plenty of cash will always come in handy. In these regions, I focus on any buildings increase income, and whilst the exact buildings vary from faction to faction, this generally means focusing on the infrastructure tab. A lot of the time there aren't enough buildings purely focused on income to fill up all building slots, so if you have them going spare, speeding along growth or bolstering control are both great ideas to get the very most out of your province. Military is exactly what it sounds like. It focuses on making as much of the roster you're making use of available for recruitment as quickly as possible. This means most of the buildings in both military recruitment and support to unlock every unit you can. It also means any building that increases recruitment capacity or rank, or that lowers recruitment cost. Again, all of these vary from faction to faction, but to keep things simple, if a building would benefit an army recruiting in the province, it's worth building when you can. There's also some that I'd recommend building in every single province, regardless of the specialization. First of all, garrisons and walls. It seems pretty overkill and a lot of extra gold, but building defensive buildings in every single province is a great idea, especially when you're just getting started with the game, for a number of reasons. First of all, it gives the settlement less chance of being taken in the event of attack. and even if it is taken, it means the attacking army will likely suffer more losses in the process and slow their advance. And all of this means you don't necessarily need to have an army sat patrolling your settlements to keep them safe, and they can instead focus on more pressing objectives. If you really want to save some cash and use those building slots for something else, I'd at the very least ensure your border settlements are well defended, and then you can afford to be a little bit more lax in the middle of your territory. Just make sure you don't get caught out. AI armies will make use of the path of least resistance, so if they find a gap in your armor, they will ravage through it and take a string of settlements before you can react. Secondly, resource buildings. Resources are spread all over the map and come in many different forms with just as many effects. They vary from resource to resource and faction to faction, but they almost always come with something worth having in your faction. Not only can you usually trade resources for some added income, the effects from those buildings cannot normally be found anywhere else, so why would you want to miss out on them? Lastly, landmark buildings. Similar to resource buildings, these can only be built in certain provinces and by certain factions in those provinces, but they are always worth building. Each one is unique, meaning the only way to get that exact combination of effects is through the building, and most of the time those effects are something you're going to want to make use of. There's also a bunch of situational buildings that you may not always need but can come in useful in certain situations. The protection building line makes it far easier to find Skaven undercities and other parasitic structures under your settlements, but don't offer a lot of value outside of this. Buildings focused on control and corruption may not always be needed, but can be extremely useful when they are. Don't be afraid to build any building if your faction and or province needs it. If you keep aiming to meet these needs, you won't go far wrong. As for what to build and when, again, it can be very situational, but I'd probably list priorities like so. First of all, income. If you're running out of gold, then increasing income needs to be a top priority. Battles can be a great way to make some cash, but if you can manage it, you want to be running on passive income for as much of the game as possible. Secondly, recruitment. That first province wants to focus on recruitment and wants to have the bulk of your resources poured into it during the early game to unlock as much of the roster as you can as fast as possible. Whenever you can, building and upgrading recruitment buildings is a great idea to help elevate the battle side of your campaign. Third is settlement upgrades. I might get some pushback on this, but I truly believe if you have spare building slots or buildings to be upgraded in a settlement, there is very little point in upgrading the main building. You are simply making more empty space instead of making full use of what you already have. Yes, high tier settlements also come with extra goodies like large garrisons and more income, but you will get far more value if you simply fill out those settlements first before worrying about rushing growth. And of course, situationally, you want to focus on solving any problem provinces as soon as you can. So improving control, bulking up defenses before enemies arrive, balancing out corruption, etc. And lastly, some general tips that don't really fit anywhere else. Make sure you don't build duplicate buildings in the same province that don't offer stacking effects. For example, having two of the same recruitment buildings most of the time doesn't give you any extra value. However, two income buildings often does. Also make sure you're making the most of commandments. These are province-wide buffs that you can switch between at will, and they come in extremely useful for a whole bunch of needs. If you're recruiting or building or struggling for cash, there will normally be an option that can help you with that thing. Certain buildings have effects that only come online once certain needs are met, such as another building being built or your faction having so much of a certain resource. These may not be in every faction, but it's worth checking to make sure you're getting as much out of your buildings as you can. Now you know what to build, you also need to know where to build it. I like to follow a checkerboard approach where you swap specializations each province you move through in each direction. So your starting province is almost always military, then your second can focus on income, then back to military, and so on, presuming you move in the same direction. The idea behind this is to have recruitments always be close by should you need it. Global recruitment is expensive and unreliable, so making sure local is available nearby will always be a win. And it ensures you have plenty of cash right out the gate, since that second province focuses on printing money to fuel the rest of the game. It can be a little tricky since provinces are hardly laid out in a perfect grid, but just do your best and it'll start making sense where you should build what. You should always put a little bit of thought into what provinces you want to expand into and which to avoid. This isn't normally decided by you, since war really does come to you in this game rather than you finding it, but you can still decide what regions you take from your enemies. In general, I'd advise sticking to provinces with a suitable climate at least until you're deep into the late game. Settlements with unpleasant or worse climates are a nightmare to build in, with increased cost and time taken alongside control issues and very little income. They are almost never worth the hassle, so stick to the green circles as much as you possibly can. I'd also say it's a good idea to own entire provinces rather than parts of them. For starters, you can't make use of commandments, so miss out on that value. but also you can't really make the most of a settlement if you can't stack with others in the province. If you own half a province and someone else has the rest, you have two options. Option 1 is to declare war and try to take the rest by force. This is fine against hostile and small and neutral factions, but just be sure to check their allies so you don't tick off any of your friends. Option 2 is diplomacy. You can attempt to trade the remaining settlement from the owner, but your mileage will vary with this one. The AI in this game vastly overvalues settlements, so the chances of them giving it to you for what it's actually worth are basically zero. So be prepared to cough up an obscene price, or flip the script and instead sell your settlement to them and just accept having a new neighbour. But what I want to know now is, what's your best tip for settlement management? Leave your suggestions down in the comments below to help out new players. I'm sure we'd both appreciate it. Like the video if you did, subscribe if you want to see more, and if you want more videos like this one, then check out this video all about how to play the Empire in 2025.